for those powerful readings. And it's good to see you all on this Palm Sunday, even though it's still through this limited medium. Now, for Christians, every part of the Bible is important. We consider it all to be a part of the Word of God. But there are some passages that stand out as being particularly important because they define the very narrative itself. And we've tried during this last year, when we've been studying the Bible, to call special attention to those passages, those moments in time that are so central to the Christian story. Think, for example, of the calling of Abraham and Sarah, which was the moment when the people of God were formed as a set-apart people. Or the Exodus from Egypt, when the Hebrews were brought out of slavery and began their journey as an independent nation. The dedication of the temple in Jerusalem, the climactic high point of Israel's history, when things seemed to be right between the people and God, and the destruction of that same temple by the Babylonians, the lowest point that we've read in the story thus far, which also reminds us of how painful and tragic reality can be and how this story tells it. These have been some of the most important moments that we've read thus far, and I would argue that the passage that Barbara and Zenaba just read for us a few minutes ago deserves to rank right among them. That the story of the triumphal entry is one of the most defining moments in the biblical story. Now, that's a little bit odd for us as Christians to hear, because typically this doesn't even stand out to us as being one of the biggest moments in Jesus's life, right? Maybe it is, but it certainly doesn't get the same attention as his birth or his death or his resurrection. And he had a lot of big moments, like the moment on Palm Sunday, right? When he fed the 5,000, or when he was baptized by John. Well, I think that if we take a step out of just looking at Jesus's life and think about how this connects with the larger story, we can appreciate it even more. Because one of the main themes that we've heard in the Bible thus far, in both Testaments, in fact, is the anticipation of the arrival of the Messiah. There was this hope that a descendant of David would come and finally take his place at the throne of David in Jerusalem and lead God's people. And this scene marks the moment when that happened. It marks the beginning of the reign of the Messiah. Now, Cheryl in Children's Story compared it to a parade, and that's right, it is kind of like a parade. But I would say that another way that we can kind of look at this is like a coronation ceremony, right? Think about it. Jesus didn't just walk straight into the temple and start turning over tables. He certainly could have done that if he wanted to. But this was a very carefully orchestrated plan. He set up a long, elaborate procession into the city, as a king might have a procession into the city. He was very intentional about the animal that he chose to ride on, which had this imagery and this connection with a new messianic leader coming into town. People waved palm branches and put their clothes before him as he came in. You even heard some folks say the words, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord." And so this represents that moment that the people had been waiting for hundreds, if not thousands of years. This hope that there would be a king who would come and who would bring liberation to the Jewish people. And we believe that Jesus came to do just that. But even as we say this, I want to be a little bit careful about how we use the language that we do, because we shouldn't throw around terms like liberation or freedom carelessly. We have to remember that the Jews were, and to an extent still are today, an oppressed people, that they faced literal oppression, that they had to watch as their people were killed, that they faced tax burdens and physical attacks and persecutions from the Romans. And it can be problematic or even offensive when we use liberation language too flippantly in these kinds of situations. You know, the example that comes to mind from American history to me is one involving Frederick Douglass. Now, you might remember Frederick Douglass was one of many slaves who escaped slavery during the mid 1800s. And he particularly stands out because he was a brilliant individual and a great orator, despite having such limited access to education. And he actually became a fairly popular speaker up in the North, in those Republican circles that were really strong on abolition. One year in 1852, after Douglass had escaped slavery, but it was still raging on in the South, a group of Republicans who were from the town of Rochester, New York, invited him to be their keynote speaker during their 4th of July celebration. And I imagine that they thought of themselves as being very progressive for, they look at this. We are inviting a former slave to speak. This is how great we are. But for Douglass, rather than being pleased by this invitation, he was troubled by it, almost even offended to an extent. And he ended up giving a very famous speech called "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," in which he said these words. Fellow citizens, pardon me, allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I or those I represent to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? To forget my fellow African Americans, to pass lightly over their wrongs, and to chime in with the popular theme would be treason in the most scandalous and shocking way, and would make me a reproach before God and the world. Now, you see, Douglass understood that when he was asked to speak, people were wanting him to sing the praises of the United States and speak about what a great country it was and how much we should enjoy this principle of independence. But for him, it was a troubling thought to be asked to do this when people that he knew, that he had grown up with, were still literally enslaved. And I think that's a warning that we need to take really seriously. When we are thinking about the Bible and the message that it brings, especially for the Jewish people, if we begin to speak flippantly about their freedom or salvation or liberation while they continue to face oppression, I don't know that we are being much better than the people who asked Frederick Douglass to sing the praises of Independence Day in the United States. And in fact, I think that Christians do fall into this error oftentimes, especially when we say things like, well, Jesus came to be the Messiah, just not in the way that the Jewish people expected it, the Messiah of the heart, not the Messiah of the body. He brought a spiritual revolution, not a political one. To do so disregards the very real suffering that people were experiencing. But when I say that Jesus came as the great liberator, I don't mean it in just a metaphorical sense. When Jesus came, he literally brought political, economic, religious change with him into Jerusalem as the rightful heir to the throne of David. We kind of have to look carefully at the story to be able to fully appreciate this, right? So we know from the Gospels that when Jesus entered into the temple, he immediately started making a ruckus, right? Turning over tables and whipping out people who were selling doves and other types of animals. But I think that even here we tend to kind of miss what's going on in the story. Because oftentimes when this cleansing of the temple incident is represented to us in art, for example, Jesus is depicted as doing these things alone, as an individual. And perhaps we might think of him as a person who had just lost his temper, he'd gone crazy, or maybe he's just trying to make a radical point, teach a lesson. But I think it's important for us to remember that Jesus wasn't, as this picture suggests, just doing these things as an individual. He was at the head of a very worked up crowd, a crowd that clearly wanted revolution, that was ready for a new king, a crowd that was intimidating and ready for change. I think if we were going to use our modern language, we'd say that he was at the head of a crowd of protesters, or perhaps even rioters, right? And I certainly don't think that he was the only one who was turning over tables. He probably had a large group of people who were participating with him in this action. If it was just him as an individual, I imagine that the people who sold the doves would have just called the temple guard and had him escorted out. But they were afraid. There was this movement, this big group of people who were demanding change, and it forced people to shut down, even board up their businesses and go away because of what was happening in the temple. Now, I say that, of course, to make some echoes with things that we see happening in our world today. But before we make the connection too closely, I want to note that these were not just random businesses that Jesus targeted. That the reason that he picked them out was because of specific things that bothered him, specific injustices about the businesses that they were engaging in. So take, for example, the doves, right? The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and John all emphasize that Jesus targeted those who sold doves and drove out people who sold doves specifically. Why was that? What's so offensive about doves, right? I mean, I thought Jesus liked doves. They came and they sat on his shoulder in beautiful pictures at the baptism. Well, it's not that there was anything that Jesus had against doves specifically. The reason that he's targeting them is because the people who sold doves were doing so to make a profit off the poor. You see, there is a provision specifically in the law that we find in Leviticus chapter 5 that says this. And you shall bring to the Lord as a penalty for the sin you have committed a female from the flock, a sheep or a goat as a sin offering. And the priest shall make atonement on your behalf for your sin. But if you cannot afford a sheep, you shall bring to the Lord as your penalty for the sin you have committed 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons. So kind of the standard expectation for most people was to bring a sheep or a goat. But recognizing that not everybody could spare a sheep or goat or even had one, God creates this alternative option for those who were poor, that they could bring in a dove as a sacrifice that would be equally acceptable. Now, the problem was that these instructions were made over 1,000 years before Jesus's time. And the economy of the Israelites had changed dramatically. Things had certainly gotten more complicated. Cities had risen up. The poor were poor in different ways. It wasn't just that everybody was a farmer anymore. There were beggars who lived in cities and people who just really had very limited access to any kinds of animals. And so for those people, even having a dove to offer was a challenging thing to do. But there were people who insisted that if you wanted to be right with God, you had to follow the letter of the law. You at least had to sell a dove. And so you at least had to sacrifice a dove. And so they made an entire industry off of selling doves to people who came in who wanted to be made right with God. And this bothered Jesus tremendously. He thought that this was a deep abuse of the principle of the law. He, in fact, points to a counterexample while he is there at the temple. He notes that there's a widow who only gives a mite as an offering in the temple. And a mite almost certainly wouldn't have been enough to afford a dove. But he points out that her offering is extremely pleasing to God because she is giving all that she has. And that's what it takes. But to suggest that you have to somehow afford a dove in Jesus's mind is like robbery. But instead of holding a gun to someone's head, you're holding religion to their head, making this whole industry what Jesus called a den of thieves or a den of robbers. And so Jesus, feeling that he was the rightful ruler of the kingdom of Israel, felt that it was his responsibility to fundamentally change this economy, to drive out this corrupt business that was keeping people from worshiping God. Now, the money changers had a similar kind of dynamic to them, except they were targeting a slightly different group, right? Because this is another difference between the time when the law was written over 1,000 years earlier and the time of Jesus' own day. In Jesus' day, Jews weren't just based in the land of Israel. They were spread out all over the known world at the time. For example, the book of Acts tells us a story about a convert to Judaism who had come up all the way from Ethiopia just to participate in one of the ceremonies of the temple. That time it was the ceremony of Pentecost when he came to celebrate. But in order to do this, once the people arrived, even though they had made tremendous sacrifices to get there, they were still expected to be able to buy the proper sacrifices, the doves or the animals that were sold at the temple. And not only that, but they had to do so with the proper currency. And so they had to go through a money exchange first. And a money exchange system wouldn't exist if there wasn't some profit motive behind it, right? So there were people who were profiting off of those who were foreigners and more vulnerable, as well as those who were poor in order to sustain this economy. And all of this bothered Jesus. So Jesus, using the force of this crowd, drives these people away. And I'm telling you, this would not have just been that they came back the next day. If you were in the business of selling doves and you knew that Jesus and his crazy supporters were still there at the temple, I'm almost certain that you wouldn't come back and try selling doves again, right? So Jesus actually changed the way that the city of Jerusalem was operating. He made it more accessible for those who were on the margins. And those aren't the only ways in which he did it. He also offered public teaching as something that anybody could have access to. It wasn't for a privileged few, a limited class. It was the teaching of God for everyone. He healed people in the temple, which meant that people who were typically excluded, maybe those who had leprosy, who weren't supposed to come in the temple, or other types of diseases, were invited in and made whole. And he transformed the city by his very presence there, making it a more just place, a place that had shalom, the peace of God, the way of the world that God had intended. But of course, if we do consider this to be Jesus's reign, it was an extraordinarily short one. He wasn't even there for an entire week before he'd been arrested and was removed from power, presumably after which those who sold doves and who did money changing were quite capable of setting up shop and going back to business as usual. And so you have to wonder what Jesus was thinking when he started this movement. Did he think that it was going to last? Well, his opponents certainly thought that Jesus was getting ready for a fight, getting ready to fight the Romans. And this was something that appropriately scared them, right? They didn't want to get into a war with the Roman people. This is one of the reasons why they felt like Jesus needed to be crucified. But that wasn't Jesus's strategy. He never intended to use violence to enforce his will. But instead, as he says in Luke 19, just before he arrives in the city, it says, as he came near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, if you, even you, had only recognized on this day the things that make for peace. But now they are hidden from your eyes. So how was Jesus going to bring about peace? A deep, just peace, one that drove out corruption and protected those who needed it, the marginalized in society, without using violence or the threat of violence to get his way. Well, that's not clear quite yet. I'm afraid we're going to have to wait at least one more week before we fully see the answer to that question. But even now, even when it's not clear how Jesus would sustain this movement, even if it looks just like a flicker in the speck of world history, we can still appreciate it as the beginning of something important. And to describe it, I'd like to actually go back to Frederick Douglass one more time. This time, instead, turning to his narrative of the life of a slave, narrated by himself, in which he tells the story of his own experience of finding freedom from slavery. Now, in this narrative, which is a classic and which everybody should read, Douglass talks about the horrors of slavery, some of the different things that he saw, and eventually his journey to freedom. But he does not actually go into details about how he escaped. That's not the turning point in his story. In fact, he later explains that he felt if he had divulged those details, that it might harm the efforts of other people who were trying to escape in the same way. So in his narrative, that's not the key turning point in the book. The key turning point for Frederick Douglass actually happened while he was still in the throes of slavery. In fact, it happened during perhaps one of his worst periods of time, when he had come under the power of a horrific slave holder named Mr. Covey, a person who had a reputation for breaking the will of slaves, of making them more docile, especially those who tried at some sense to stand up for their dignity. And he's just a 16-year-old boy at this point. And he tells a story of a time in which Mr. Covey went to whip him, but Douglass physically stopped him. He holds his hand against the whip and refuses to be harmed in that way. Now, we might be inclined to see what happened next as an episode of violence. There certainly was a scuffle that Douglass said lasted for a couple of hours. But I really don't think that it is violence in a sense that we need to be deeply troubled about. I mean, we even have things in our own tradition, recent tradition, like Mennonite martial arts, in which we talk about standing up for yourself while doing minimal harm to your persecutor. And certainly Douglass made no efforts to try to kill Mr. Covey, although he may have been justified in doing so, either at that moment or any time later. But he did use force to keep himself from being whipped, knowing that there could be repercussions from it. And even though he continued to live as a slave, he narrated that moment as the turning point in his life. the moment when his freedom began. And this is how he frames it in his narrative. He says, "This battle with Mr. Covey was the turning point in my career as a slave. It rekindled the few expiring embers of freedom and revived within me a sense of my own humanity. However long I might remain a slave in form, the day had passed forever when I could be a slave in fact." Now, we want to be careful, again, to say that just because he went through this experience of standing up for himself and realizing that he was no worse than any other human being, it doesn't mean that his literal freedom was irrelevant. On the contrary, it motivated him all the more to seek literal liberation for himself and eventually for all of the other people that he knew as well. Nevertheless, that moment of freedom began with him taking a clear stand for right and wrong, one that he never backed away from, even when it wasn't clear how he would be able to sustain it. And on Palm Sunday, that's precisely what we see Jesus do. He goes into the temple, into the heart of the religious, historical, political land of Israel. And he takes a stand. He stands for what's right, even when it's not clear how he's going to be able to defend it. And he never backs down from that. In fact, this still continues to happen today. Throughout history, in all points in the world, there have been times when Christians and people who have been inspired by the word of Christ have stood up, even though they've had no seeming protection around them, and have said, "This is what God says is right. We cannot go with this teaching. We cannot allow this oppression to continue. We cannot stand for this any longer." And amazingly, that witness, that power has carried on through the ages as Jesus continues to stand in the world today. So my prayer is that as we celebrate his reign as king, one that to many people seems like just a matter of words or celebration of the past, that we will be able to see him standing in the world today, and that we'll have the courage to stand with him.